for you, what was the key to composition for this project?
Ooh, well, I'd read the script about a year before, and I'd been in touch with Joe and Anthony, who I've worked with before, you know, on the Captain America Winter Soldier and Civil War. I knew it was going to be a really unusual project just from reading the script, but I don't think anything could have prepared me. When I saw I really got going when I saw the first cut of the film. Yeah. And it's an extremely unusually crafted film with an interesting, it had a curious balance of tone. You know, it has, you know, serious subject matter like PTSD and OxyContin and, you know, various traumatic things, but it also has this sort of weird wry humor, and it's also kind of a love story, but it isn't. It's got various things in the mix, and you have to do a sort of delicate dance musically as to what to do. So I kind of went into deep thought for a while. It was quite intimidating, and talking to Joe and Anthony, their whole thing was like, look, here's the thing. I think the music should be really experimental, really esoteric. We can do all kinds of strange things, but yet at the same time, because the movie is quite chaptered in the way it's told, there's somehow got to be a unifying element as well. So I took the slightly unusual approach to go, well, you know what, instead of just diving in to write the cues straight away, this is such an unusual movie, I think I've got to step back for a bit. And I started writing standalone pieces. I would put up a still, having read an area of the script or watched a part of the movie. And the first thing I did was write my sort of cherry suite. And the last track on the soundtrack album, called The Come Down, which I think Apple actually released as a sort of teaser, that piece is very much an arrangement of the original Cherry idea that I had. And then it being such an unusual movie, there were a whole lot of other strains of music that were required. There was, hang on, I'll just go to the piano a second. There was a whole thing when... which is, well, obviously I hit a wrong note there, but, yeah, that's sort of, there's many different sort of flavors to it. That little ditty that I just played is sort of in the style of an Eric Satie, Chopin-esque sort of piano etude or something like that. Whereas other music for the movie is, you know, there's a heavy use of these old analog synths. It's almost in a kind of Blade, right? Like the big sort of sweeping love theme.
Do you know, it reminded me, sorry, it reminded me of, I don't take this the wrong way, it reminded me of Vangelis.
I'd take that as a massive compliment.
Because there's a little bit in the actual film toward the beginning where he sees...
When I first saw you, exactly. When you see the first title card,
And it's there's a little bit of, because obviously Vangelis did Blade Runner, and there's a little bit of that, and just a little bit, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think part of the reason for that, the tune itself isn't necessarily that Vangelis, but I think the reason you get that feeling is those synths from the late 70s, early 80s, none of its plugins. I was actually using an MKS50, which can be a bit of a nightmare to use, and, you know, the oscillators are a bit unstable and, you know, needs repairing. It's like using a vintage car, but it has a certain emotion to the sound. And I can't speak for exactly what synths were used, but there's, you know, Vangelis wasn't using plugins. He was using, you know, probably a bit of a Prophet, maybe a bit of, you know, Korg, what's it called? The MS-20, whatever. Synths from a certain era. So I was using to play the other main tune, the Cherry, was this. It'll sound rubbish on the piano, but the basic thing was going. Etc., etc. And that, you know, doesn't sound too good on a piano, but once on the MKS50, you get these giant soaring synth sounds, and that's probably what you were responding to. So, you know, there's some of that. There was also a whole story. I wrote a piece called "Your Fate is Darkly Determined." There was a sort of very minimalist, dark electronica type piece. And, you know, and there was another piece I wrote called "What I'm Trying to Say Is," that we use for Emily, that has sort of ukulele and Andean harp and zither and sort of much more acoustic plucking little instruments, which I very incompetently played myself thanks to COVID with a lot of editing and whatnot. So it was pretty experimental. There's a lot of different textures going, but I think the thing that saved me was the thing that lived with me a lot was Joe and Anthony saying, we can do all these things. It's great if it's diverse. We can have these analog synths, we can have weird mangled guitars, we can have this Chopin approach. But if there's some way to unify it, and the unifying element was that Cherry theme, which appears in different guises, sometimes on the piano, sometimes in different harmonizations. There's a very odd tracked up cello version of it full of distortion and quarter tone tuning and all the rest of it. So there's, whilst the colors change a hell of a lot throughout the movie, there is some thematic consistency, which I hope stops it from the sort of, from the review that goes, oh, you know, the music's interesting and diverse, but it's a bit of a dog's breakfast and it's all over the place.
No, yeah, if you, I think my review goes up, it's embargoed until February 25th. So,
right.
But
cool.
I don't.
Well, don't let me put words into your mouth. If you think it's a dog's breakfast, that's fine.
It's already written, but it doesn't say that, I promise. So obviously, I was going to ask you about narrative structure, but you've sort of implied that was inherent within the composition, the way you wanted to do it. I was going to say that for me, perspective, and it is quite an important element within the film. So for you, how did point of view, as in point of view from the character, how did that play into the score? Oh,
that's a very perceptive remark, because that was key to so many of the filmmaking discussion. The great thing about working with Joe and Nancy, because I've worked with them before, we had all, you know, lengthy kind of film, before even getting into the sort of details of music, we'd have lengthy filmmaking discussions about the movie, which is something that is easier to do when you have this, you know, a relationship that's, you know, built over the years. And what you've said is remarkably prescient, because it was the key to so many things. For example, when it cuts to Iraq for the first time, you get the big helicopter shot, you see the military hardware. Now, you know, we've seen that kind of thing, and you could, you know, really good movie. I'm thinking like Black Hawk Down, or we've seen posh helicopter shots of military hardware, and you could sort of do a third-party cue that goes Iraq, war, military. And what was absolutely key in the filmmaking is the cue that starts over Iraq is it's closer to Radiohead, or, you know, it's this sort of weird indie, half guitar, half mangled electronica cue that doesn't say big helicopter shot Iraq, third party music, so that you still inhabit the perspective of the Iraq section from the experience of Cherry. And we found that all the way through the movie. You can't really, in other words, even though there's a whole section in Iraq, there's no filmmaking polemic about the wisdom or non-wisdom of America, whether they should or should not have been in Iraq, whether the neoconservatives were all fantasists and blah, blah, blah. All of that it's not about that. It's about Cherry and how he's a fish out of water, how he had his heart broken, and with no other options decided to sign up, and then finds himself in Iraq, and what that feels like for him. That's really what it's about. You know, you can't read too much else into any political opinions or how the war's going or whatever. It really is his experience. So therefore that impact, so what we found with the music is in almost every turn of this movie, that was the secret to unlocking how to approach the music, which is, yes, there's this sort of semi-Ridley Scott-esque shot of the desert and it looks amazing, but don't fall into the trap of doing a big establishing type cue. The reverse is true. Go intimate and go smaller, go kind of indie rock on it, and it will feel like this is what it feels like for the young man Cherry, and how disorientating the whole experience is. And that carried on through the training, you know, the crazy barking drill sergeants has this subversive counterpoint music while they're all screaming and shouting. There's this weird, almost kind of Aphex Twinny undercurrent to it all. So it's like it doesn't really support the drill sergeant shouting. It's just a sort of contrapuntal weirdness to it. And so counterpoint and subverting the normal genre maneuvers was the key to everything. In other words, the first thing you think of doing, don't do that.
Don't do that, yeah.
Just don't do that. Do something that's probably the opposite of what you would think might be the thing to do.
I mean, honestly, I watched the film and I've had to rewind it, to stop and go back about 3 or 4 times at various points, just so that I could understand what was going on. Not because it didn't make sense, because I didn't want to miss any of the detail because there's a lot going on.
Yeah. There is a lot, yeah.
So obviously, as you say, you've worked with the Russo brothers before, most recently for Extraction, and obviously going back through the Marvel films. What was it? What was the main incentive for getting involved in this? Because obviously, Cherry's a completely different proposition than, should we say, anything other.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I mean, I'm not in the slightest bit, you know, one must never sound like ungrateful in any way, but, you know, I've been so lucky with the career I've had and all the, you know, animated films, you know, blockbuster films. You don't have a million, when you first start out in your career, you say yes to the first thing that comes up. You're lucky to even be asked to do anything, you know, could be, think of all the talented people who could be writing film music and may never get the chance, you know what I mean? You're lucky to even get asked in the first place. And then if you're lucky enough to have a career that starts to have choices and options to it, you're absolutely right in identifying Cherry as off the beaten track from a yeah, exactly. But well, the simple answer is, you know, I absolutely love doing that sort of movie. And the other thing to say about it is they don't grow on trees. You know, there aren't that many. I remember saying to Joe and Auntie, okay, well, make sure you make something else, you know, of this, not exactly similar to Cherry, but in terms of its ruthless artistic integrity, you know, those sort of movies don't grow on trees. And when they do crop up, there's a whole host of extremely talented composers who want to do them. So, you know, you can't expect that you're always going to be asked to do them. And so I feel looking at the half glass full version of the world, I feel extremely grateful that the Russos, having conquered the world with you know, everything. Avengers and Captain, yeah exactly. Because I've got this relationship with them, I got the opportunity to show that I can write music of a slightly different type to a slightly different kind of film. I would look at that glass half full and hope that it's the beginning of being, you know, offered more of those kind of things. And I was lucky enough to have this relationship with the Russos. Well, they chose to depart massively from the big films they've been doing. Yeah, exactly. So really, I was lucky that their choice in their next film was this, and that I was able to get involved. Perfect. And the more that happens, the happier I'll be. You know?
So I've spoken to quite a few other composers, and this question has cropped up a few times. So in terms of obviously music composition and filmmaking, they're quite they're quite diametrically opposed in terms of their language. So a lot of composers I've spoken to have said finding a common language when it comes to communicating your ideas for score and their ideas for score has always been a big challenge. So how have you done that on a project by project basis, not going into massive detail, but as you say, you've had a diverse career thus far, so it seemed a relevant
question. That's a really good question.
Thank you.
No, it is a really good question. Well, without sounding cocky about it, I think it can get easier because when you start out, there's probably a bit less trust than, well, you know, if you ring James Newton Howard and go, well, are we lucky enough for him to be available and can he do the score? You're not allowed to go, well, is it going to be any good? Is he any good? Well, what sort of thing? It's just like, well, you know, there's going to be a certain amount of relaxation, like he said yes. Yeah, and of course, you'll get into the creative detail and, you know, it may be, oh, James is fantastic and blah, 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 and the discussion starts. But there'll be an overarching trust and confidence in the fact we all know James Newton Howard is fantastic, you know, same with Alan Silvestri. I'm not comparing myself to them because think how long they've been doing film music. But I think once you've done a certain amount of music, that there'll be a basic level of confidence that this is a person who is capable of understanding the aesthetics of a film, the narrative of a film, and seems to have a proven track record of figuring out some half decent idea of what to do. So, which is not necessarily the case, you know, when you start out, there's probably more uncertainty as to whether it's going to work out. And, you know, I'd love to say the world only reacts to the truth of the music being written, but of course there's always the sort of political confidence that surrounds, people feel comfortable, don't they?
Yeah,
you know,
sure.
So there's that. But then I suppose, one of the things that helps me, I think, apart from, you know, Matthew Vaughn gets quite hands-on in specific, often we argue about it, and I wish he didn't, but in a good way. He's more like by his own admission, he's like, oh, I wish I was a music producer. I just did movies because I just couldn't make it as music producer, which is slightly self-effacing assessment of his output. But I think one of the things that helps me is I can sort of jump onto their side of the fence, meaning I try and reserve musical solutions for myself. And then when talking about a movie, you know, I think one of the secret ingredients to movie making is actually literary criticism, meaning you could potentially have someone who has fantastically creative musical ideas, who has absolutely no narrative or like lit crit skills, so that they keep writing music and it's just not helping the movie. It's brilliant music, but not helping the movie. And if you were a producer, you'd actually be better off as someone potentially slightly less musically genius with a phenomenal sense of narrative and structure and story, because every time they do something, they're helping, you know, helping the film. So very often the discussions I have with directors lean into the filmmaking and what's trying to be achieved, and then I'll just take that away and then provide a musical solution. And so, you know, sometimes things get detailed, like, oh, I love this, but I think this color is a little bit too evocative of something. You know, you'll get, of course, you'll get specific remarks, particularly when you get into the mechanics of an individual cue. But as for like the initial writing of ideas and themes, particularly with Joe and Anthony, you know, it's just sort of hit or miss, really. I think with Cherry, it's just like, let me go into hiding and I'll go off and write this 9-minute so-called masterpiece, which you'll either go, nope, I don't think there'll be anything in between. You'll either hear it and go, I don't know why you think that's useful, or that goes back even to Winter Soldier. I wrote this pretty unconventional suite for Winter Soldier, which is on the album. I think it's just called The Winter Soldier. And it's, you know, it's not a pleasant listen. It's barbaric and gnarly and all screwed up and has very little orchestra, is, you know, psychologically disturbing to listen to. And not the first thing you would think of to do, you know, a superhero villain. And so, and it's very early days with them. I played it and said, look, I'm going to turn this up very loud and just play this 7-minute piece of music called Winter Soldier, which I'm warning you is a pretty unpleasant thing to listen to. And I think you're either going to love it and think it's brave and courageous, or you're going to go, I never, ever wish to hear that again. So here we go. You know, and I just played it. And they loved it because they're quite brave, you know, they're very brave. So with them, I have a particular relationship where I feel a sort of unwritten permission to try, and it doesn't always work. I remember I did something on Cherry. I was like, well, you know, this could be interesting. Let's go for a kind of satirical piece for harpsichord, and, you know, it'll be a kind of pseudo-baroque safe break-in cue. And Joe hears it, goes, hey, this is great. It's a great piece, but I think it's too wide a swing for the scene, you know. So it doesn't always work, but I think with a lot of all relationships with directors are different, but very often it's good to keep the conversation in the area of what you're trying to achieve in the film, and reserve the musical solution. It's not always the case, but it's often better that you don't get into enormous detail until you're into an individual cue and a certain thing is sticking out, or you know, a particular phrase, or just the mechanics of a cue. It's good to be able to cross into the filmmaking discussion and not only talk music, because you've got to understand what the film is for. Whenever there's a challenging situation I've ever had in filmmaking, I very rarely start prattling on about violas. I just go, well, hang on a sec, since this is the third attempt to see what are we trying to achieve, given that this is a complex scene, there's a few different narrative strands that you could bring out, and you could go against it and you could go with it. Let's have a discussion about what is the most important thing to you about the scene. What are we actually trying to do? What's your objective in terms of the filmmaking as the director? And then have that conversation, and that will, if they're a decent director, if they're a hopeless director, you'll get a vague load of waffle, and you'll realize they actually don't have a consistent vision of what they're trying to do. But if that conversation goes well, and they go, well, I'm glad you asked, because look, I finally figured out this scene, and you have that discussion, and that helps you, like, okay, well, if that's the case, I think we should go in this musical direction, because that will be the one that most supports what you're trying to achieve.
Perfect. I've got a couple more questions. So considering, again, the experience that you've had, and obviously our current situation within the industry, what do you think the chances are that that studios will move away from, shall we say, blockbuster films toward more small scale films in terms of going forward into the future?
Yeah, that's another good question, which is I'm not enough of a sort of economic film analyst to really know the answer to that question. But there's no denying, I mean, it brings up an interesting point, which is, I mean, before COVID happened, there's no denying that if you had a needle slowly swinging, you know, if you go to 2003, the amount of consumption of content that was streaming, you know, is right down here, and DVDs and going to the cinemas here, and, you know, and that needle was drifting this way as more and more streaming was happening. And I'm not even sure, because I'm not an analyst or whatever, I don't know whether that was concurrent. I don't know if pre-COVID cinema audiences were dropping, or whether it was a bit like, you remember when way back when VHS came out, there was all this like, oh no, if we have VHS, no one's going to go to the. Actually, what happened was cinema going went up as well as
exactly,
So I don't exactly. So I don't know whether it was one of those zero-sum things where as streaming was going up, people were bothering less to go to the cinema. But I think probably like in many other aspects of life, probably the COVID experience will probably accelerate trends that were already in motion. But who knows? I don't know. I mean, we'll just have to see. If I knew the answer to that, I guess I'd be a genius at the stock market or something. Maybe post-COVID, there'll be this huge human economic outburst because people are so relieved to go back to restaurants and cinemas and have communal experiences and don't want to sit at home.
I think so.
Streaming, I think that may be true. And as for the types of movies that get greenlit, you know, giant commercial ventures that are more a franchise movie that can cost between, you know, $100 and $200 million versus independent movies, I honestly don't know. I mean, knowing how capitalism works, I would have thought that you will always get a machine blasting out while money is to be made. If significant evidence starts that, it's like, you know how people complain about McDonald's. I always think that, you know, if you think burgers are so hideous, the good thing about McDonald's is, unlike the Soviet Union, they can't keep making burgers unless people eat them. If for whatever reason, if there was a cultural change where people just could not be bothered with cheap burgers and didn't eat them, it's over. They're done. They would either have to suddenly have McSalads, or they would have to respond very quickly or die.
They have to sell off all their real estate, wouldn't they?
Exactly. So whilst people enjoy, and I'm not being snobbish about it or judgmental, a lot of movie going experience, there's a wide range of experience. Some is thoughtful and interesting, and some is, you know, you want some light entertainment. And whilst those kind of movies are popular and do well, I suspect they'll carry on being made. But I think it's a wide, eclectic church. I don't think we need to panic. It's, you know, it's tempting to sort of be as disparaging as possible about commercial entertainment. But if you look at it, it's always run alongside, well, first of all, it's perfectly possible to have commercial entertainment. It's incredibly well made. Look at the Russos with you know, there's no point being snob. It's the same in pop music. You can get stuff that's commercially successful and actually really well made.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no guarantee just because something has a worthy subject matter and only cost $1 million to make that it's somehow good. It could be pretentious and rubbish, you know. So, yeah, exactly. So it's a wide church where everything can rub alongside. I don't see why you can't have hopelessly, cynically made commercially films that are rubbish, brilliant commercial films that are very well done, incredibly rewarding artistic films that are very well made, and rubbish, pretentious artistic guff. Pretentious guff that doesn't have any artistic merit whatsoever. I mean, it's probably ever been thus.
It's very true. By the way, I wanted to mention that Cherry is there are so many elements of art. It's almost art house in its construction in certain ways. So yeah, I could talk about that all day, but I'm going to jump to my final question, which is, in your opinion, having worked with Disney as many times as you have done, what remains the key to their longevity? It's a bit of an open-ended question.
Ooh. Wow, I mean, these are you're almost expecting a level of expertise I probably just don't have.
Well, sort of familiarity more than
Well, also it's a question that we're pertaining to. I mean, Disney have been around for a long time.
I know. I know.
Well, before I could say anything useful or sensible about it. But the encounters I've had with Disney, both, you know, specifically in the music department and with the executives and so on, there is definitely a cultural emphasis on quality of story. Now, of course, that's such a dumb thing to say, because it's like, what are you suggesting that, like, you know, most studios go, oh yeah, don't worry about story, we'll just make any old crap.
Yeah.
Of course, no one sets out with the intention of not caring about story, but stuff happens. Things get complicated. Movies are difficult to make. They're expensive. Things go wrong. Rewrites start happening. People start scrambling. Things get greenlit when perhaps the script isn't nailed. And in that delicate balance of all the millions of things that have to come into a harmonious relationship for something to work, which is a miracle with a movie, because, you know, we've all seen movies where you look at the cast and go, oh, this is going to be great. And then you watch it and go, wow, how did this go wrong? You know?
What happened?
Yeah, what happened? Because the truth is, it's really, really difficult to make a good film. The most likely statistical outcome of a filmmaking endeavor is that it will be reasonably good, or a little bit under that. It is unusual for something to be abominably hopeless, and it's extremely unusual for something to be exceptionally brilliant. Yeah. Your most likely outcome is it's like quite good and gets 61% on Rotten Tomatoes. You know, that's the most statistically the most likely outcome. So my experience at Disney, and they have a very special relationship with music where they take it seriously. They don't cut corners. If an artistic suggestion is made that would help the film, there isn't corner cutting. If it costs money, the money is forthcoming to get something done because it's a good idea. And in just watching the directors for the animated films I've done and the relationship with the executives, there's a particular, in Disney, there's always been a particular, I've noticed, particularly in like any discussion about extended action sequences, which in other studios, or you can get carried away with how cool an action sequence is. I've noticed at Disney where if there's no narrative content, then they're not, you know, this is just meaningless. This is just visceral action and isn't going anywhere unless it's got a character developmental aspect to it or a narrative aspect. You know, large stretches of just, you know, choreographized people hitting each other doesn't really fly. So, I mean, I can't speak for the real early history of Disney, but my experience is of a music, it's you know, I mean, it's particularly through music, is a real respect for what music can do for the film, and the executive financial support to make sure that corners are not cut wherever possible. Everything that can be done to help the movie within reason, you know, can happen. So, which we'll have to see with the new generation of streaming, and, you know, there's always a worry of like, oh, well, they'll just try and go, well, hang on, can't we just bang out the music for, you know, X amount of grand and we'll just do it all with samples? I haven't experienced that. The positive, I have not experienced that thus far, but, you know, hopefully a leaf can be taken out of that traditional approach where you accept that you know, certain aspects of filmmaking may cost a bit of money. If you want a symphony orchestra and you don't want to use something, it costs money, you know, but it sounds better.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Henry. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
I hope I get the opportunity to speak to you again soon, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.